So welcome everybody to another session of the Tartan Slam series. We're very excited to have you guys here again. Today on the Tartan Slam series, we have two PhD students from the Robot Perception Lab here at CMU. They're going to be giving their presentation. Please feel free to send us any questions you had if you're watching us from YouTube or from Zoom or using the questions link. So let's get started. Our first presenter is Paloma Sodhi with her talk about learning in infectographs for tactile perception. Paloma got her bachelor's in electric and electronic engineering at IIT Guwahati and has been at CMU since 2015, where she got her master's in robotics and is now a final year PhD student. Paloma is a recipient of the CMU Presidential Fellowship and is currently supported by Facebook AI Research. So I'm sure this is going to be quite interesting. Welcome, Paloma.
Thank you so much, Lucas, for the introduction. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So hello, everyone. I'm Paloma Sodhi, and it's very nice to be here. I'm a final year PhD student in robotics at Carnegie Mellon, advised by Cookies. Today, I'll be talking about some of my PhD thesis work on learning in factographs for tactile perception. So this work is in collaboration with Stuart Anderson and Mustafa Mukat, AI Research, Pittsburgh, and Eric Dexheimer and Michael Case at CMU-RI. Okay, so just a little bit about my research background. So broadly, I work on problems of efficient inference from complex sensor data sequences. So for example, I started off looking at agricultural vision data during my master's, which I moved on to working with underwater sonar data. And over the past year or so, I've been working on tactile perception and in particular, these image-based tactile sensors. The underlying theme and the topic of this talk about is how we can leverage machine learning to be able to extract salient information and sparse optimization to efficiently fuse such information. So I would like to begin by very generally motivating the perception problem using a story. And this is the story of an elephant and a group of blindfolded people trying to make sense of what they are perceiving. You can think of the elephant as some sort of a latent state X that needs to be estimated. However, each individual person here only gets a local glimpse into the state X in the form of touch measurements or observations Z. So each observation independently only tells us part of the story about the state. But if we combine these observations, we can solve for, so more formally, we need to solve for an inference problem where we would like to estimate the probability of states X given a set of observations Z. So coming back to the robotics context, let's consider this problem of a robot finger pushing around an object. Now, oftentimes, the robot cannot directly see the object due to occlusions. And touch in such cases can provide local yet precise information about the state of the object. So what makes the problem hard? The first challenge is partial observability, where each tactile observation or measurement only provides partial information about the object pose. A second challenge is that the tactile observations themselves are complex, for which we don't have a great a priori model. So here you see an example of a tactile image measurement from a vision-based tactile sensor called Digit. And now we need to be able to reason over multiple such complex in order to collapse uncertainty about the state, which is the object pose in this case. Now, in order to reason over multiple observations efficiently, we will model this problem as that of an inference over a factor graph. So a factor graph that you probably saw in some of the earlier talks is a graph with two types of nodes. The first type are latent variable nodes X that need to be estimated. And the second type are the factor nodes phi. So the latent variables X here are the object poses. And the factor nodes phi that you see encode relationships like dynamics factors between consecutive poses. Now, if you're using just dynamics, our estimates will eventually drift over time. To correct for that, we need some observation model factors that can map between the tactile image observations and the states. All right. So yeah, just to recap, we had a factor graph representation of the problem where our inference objective is to determine the most likely set of states the object poses given a set of tactile observations. And we have like efficient, sparse, incremental solvers to solve for this objective efficiently. So yeah, so given this graph inference framework, we receive a sequence of tactile image observations from which we must infer a sequence of latent objects poses. And we solve this inference problem over a factor graph, which, as we saw earlier, relies on having observation models that can map between observations and states. However, image-based tactile sensors such as these produce observations that are complex and typically difficult to model analytically. So can we instead learn these observation models from data? So let's begin by asking a more fundamental question, which is what makes for a good observation model? So a simple model would be to directly map the tactile images that you see on the left to object poses. However, if you look at the images closely, it's hard to say a whole lot about where the object is. In fact, this image stream on the left was generated during one of the planar pushing trials. And just looking at a single image, it's pretty hard to localize what the object poses. An alternate design that we proposed to use in our prior ICRA work was to have a different observation model, where instead of learning a direct mapping, we learn a mapping from relative image observations to relative states. So we do this by featureizing each image and learning a mapping from the displacement of features in the feature space between the two images to the relative object pose about the point of contact. These predictions can then get incorporated as relative factors between non-sequential poses in the graph, which in turn enable us to correct for the accumulated drift in the object pose estimates. Now, additionally, the graph framework also allows us to incorporate engineered physics and geometric models that we use from existing literature as factors into the graph. And this really helps in adding informative priors and constraining the space of solutions. So specifically, the geometric factors that we use penalize object and end effector intersections, and the physics factors add quasi-static dynamics priors into the graph. So now that we have a design choice for our observation model, the next natural question is, how do we train such a model? So the first approach that we'll take is a straightforward one, where we will use supervised learning, notably minimizing the regression loss on ground truth data. So there are 3 steps to this process. Step 1, collect ground truth trajectories. Step 2, select any 2 timestamps, pick the pose and measurements at those timestamps, and add it to a data set. And step 3, train the observation model that we saw earlier on this data set. So recall that the model maps a pair of tactile images to a relative displacement. So we can create a L2 loss and minimize this to train the model. Okay, so the question here that you might wonder is, why do we call this a surrogate loss? Notice that we did not invoke the optimizer during the training process. So we aren't really taking into account how errors in the model impact the optimization error. And we will return to this point later in the talk. And let's see how this approach does in practice. So we evaluate this approach for tracking object poses during planar pushing tasks. And this is the overall experimental setup with close-ups on the object, end effector, motion capture, and the digit tactile sensor. This is a typical planar pushing trial with a rectangular object. The top left shows the tactile images captured by the digit tactile sensor. And as the object is pushed, we see that the contact patch in the tactile image observations move around. So the result here that I want to highlight is on the post-tracking performance by being able to incorporate these learned relative observation model factors into the factor graph. See, on the left, we have the learned factor results. And on the right, we have just a contact detector, which is typical information you'd get from a binary contact sensor. And for this trajectory, you can see that the contact detector only estimates on the right drift enough that it localizes about a completely wrong point once we make and break contact. And we show more evaluations on different trials with the rectangular object and some other object shapes. And we see that the learning-based observation model in the factor graph is able to reliably track the object over time as opposed to just using binary contact information. For more details, this is in the ICRA paper that I have referred to below. So I want to focus the latter half of the talk on some recent work that we've been looking at, where we want to now minimize over a different loss, like over the final loss that we actually care about. So the approach thus far, which is approach 1, we have, while simple, is training on a surrogate loss and doesn't aim to minimize the final tracking error directly, which is ultimately what we care about. So we'll now talk about approach 2 that tackles this problem. So the elephant in the room now is that learning now must consider the optimizer in the loop. So what would this learning look like? Now in forward pass, we have a learn observation model feeding into the graph optimizer to produce an optimized trajectory, x hat. This optimized trajectory is then compared to the ground truth trajectory, xgt, to compute an end-to-end tracking loss, L theta. The loss is then backpropagated through one step so as to update theta. But there are two main problems with this approach. The first problem is that many state-of-the-art graph optimizers are not natively differentiable. So for instance, the ISM2 graph optimizer used popularly for SLAM invokes a series of non-differentiable Bayes tree operations and heuristics. A second problem is that even if one did want to differentiate through the nonlinear optimizer, one would typically have to do this by unrolling through successive optimization steps and then backpropagating gradients through this optimization procedure. However, training in this manner can have undesired effects. For example, prior work has shown instances where even though unrolling gradient descent drives training loss to 0, the resulting energy surface does not have a minima on the ground truth. So in other words, the learned energy surface is sensitive to the optimization procedure used during training, for example, the number of unrolling steps or even the learning rate. So we argue that instead of caring about the optimization procedure, we should only care about the shape of the function that the optimizer has to minimize. And this is precisely what energy-based models aim to do. So in our most recent work, we propose this approach, LEO, learning energy-based models in a graph optimizer. So let's start with the approach by looking at a truth trajectory, xgt. To easily visualize the energy function, we will collapse the trajectory down to a single axis. Now, let's initialize with a random energy function. Note that the ground truth, xgt, is far from the minima in this scenario. So Leo begins by sampling trajectories x hat around the minima by invoking the graph optimizer, which is what you would expect since it's optimizing for the minima of the cost function that it's given. The energy-based update rule then is simple, push down the cost of ground truth trajectories and push up samples around the minima. So if we keep repeating this process, the minima of this function will eventually around the ground truth. And at convergence, the gradients of the samples x hat on average match the gradient of the ground truth trajectory xgt. So how does LEO work in practice? Let's begin with a simple 2D problem. So we have samples from a ground truth print, and we would like to learn a network that maps xy to an energy value. So we randomly initialize the network visualized here with high energy values in dark blue and low energy values in white. Notice that the ground truth is quite far away from the minima. Over successive LEO iterations, the energy value converged to a basin around the ground truth function in green. And we repeat this experiment with varying seeds and sampling and observe that LEO consistently converges to an energy function with low energies at ground truth and high energies elsewhere. And this is desirable if we want the graph optimizer to eventually give us solutions that would lie close to the ground truth. So let's, like now that we look at the approach working conceptually, let's look at some robot applications that we test on. So the first is a synthetic navigation task, where the goal is to estimate robot poses from odometry and GPS observations. The second is the same real-world planar pushing task that we saw earlier, where the goal is to estimate object poses from just tactile image observations. For the synthetic navigation task, we learn covariance parameters for GPS and odometry measurements. So here are some results on the test data set trajectory. And what you see is that we initialize LEO with random covariance parameters. And over successive iterations, it is able to learn the right covariance parameters that drive the optimized trajectories close to the ground truth. So by right, I mean that the parameters that would make the final track loss go to 0, which is what we earlier saw as the end-to-end loss that we would like to minimize. I also want to highlight one such trajectory run and visualize how the samples evolve over time. So if you remember, we saw the samples in the 2D energy surface case, and we visualize these samples as trajectory samples in the navigation task, since it's a high dimensional space. So initially you see that when the energy function is incorrect, the samples are more spread out. Over iterations, as the energy function evolves, the samples start to concentrate about the ground truth. For the real world planar pushing task, we learn both the mean and covariance parameters for tactile image measurements. Now, unlike approach 1, approach 2 allows us to learn covariances as well. So we evaluate LEO on test dataset trajectory with 2 different objects. So a rectangular object and the ellipse. And again, here we initialize LEO with random model parameters. So here the model parameters were the covariances as well as the weights of the tactile factor network that we saw earlier. So over successive iterations, you can see that it's able to learn parameters that is trying to drive optimized trajectories to lie close to the ground truth. So the visualizations here is actually the outer loop or the learning loop that you see here, and each loop runs the ISAM2 optimizer to convergence. So I want to summarize by bringing back the key challenge on how do we learn observation models in factor graph frameworks. So to recap, we talked about factor graphs being a powerful framework for efficiently reasoning over multiple observations. However, one bottleneck that we saw was that observation models for many real complex sensors can be complicated to hand design, and hence we must rely on to learn these models from data to optimize for the final tasks that we care about. And we talked about two ways of going about this problem, but I want to discuss the trade-offs of both approaches here. So the approach one, where we were training on a surrogate loss independent of the graph optimizer, has the pros that it is easy to train, direct supervision. However, it doesn't take into account the final tracking loss. Approach two, the pros are that it does consider the final tracking loss. And as a result of which, it allows us to learn parameters that we may not have direct ground truth supervision on. But the con is that it requires invoking the optimizer during training. And this can be expensive depending on what kind of models that you have that you're trying to learn end to end. In practice, though, what you can do is use approach one to bootstrap towards approach two. So learn a certain initial set of parameters with approach one and plug in those models into the graph optimizer and let the end-to-end approach refine those parameters. Finally, I want to just link to the relevant papers and the code. So we open source code for both papers. The second approach is very new. So feel free to check out the implementation and play around with it. Yeah, we'd love to hear any feedback on either of these. And with that, thank you so much for your time.
Okay, thank you, Paloma. That was very cool, very interesting. Now we'll move forward to the next talk. So our second presenter of the day is Sudharshan Suresh. He'll be giving a talk about Tactile SLAM, inferring object shape and pose through touch. Sudharshan got his bachelor's at the National Institute of Technology, Tiruchirappalli, of Control Engineering, Instrumentation and Control Engineering. And then also came to CMU, got his robotics master's, and is now a PhD candidate with Professor Michael Case. So let's welcome Sudharshan.
All right, thank you. I just want to confirm if my slides are good. Is it visible?
Yes, your slides there. We can hear you. It's all good.
Okay, just give me 1 sec. Let me just set up the webcam, and I should be good to go. All right, thank you. So welcome to my presentation that kind of bookends what Paloma talked about on Tactile SLAM. So Paloma, through her, okay, just to give you a brief again, I'm a second year PhD, second going third year PhD student working with Michael in the robot perception lab. So Paloma, through her excellent talk, kind of explained the role of high dimensional tactile signals in object localization. And instead, I'll be trying to, just to cover all the bases, I'll be describing sort of a parallel line of work, which uses more rudimentary sensing in the context of what one would call like a full conventional SLAM problem, where you're actually trying to map these objects. All right. So just in case I don't get any time at the end, I'd like to start out by thanking my advisor, Michael, co-authors and members of RPL for all their help with this research. One, again, big collaborator was Alberto in the MIT MCube lab with this work, and all the collaborators for this research, Maria, Peter, Josh, all of them did play a big role in this work. And if you're interested, you can have a look at these publications to read more about the nuts and bolts of what we're talking about. So we'll begin by motivating what this problem is. Paloma did cover a good aspect of why tactile perception is important. We believe that tactile perception at the distal end of a robot arm is crucial, especially in these unstructured environments. And making sense of these for like household robots in kitchens and working with robot parts in factories for this wide spectrum of activities is quite important. And the other problem is that passive perception or using just cameras may not give us the full picture of what's in a scene due to things like self-occlusion, occlusion from clutter, visual degradation. All of these sort of necessitate using interaction or interactive perception to get a full picture of what the scene is. So the dream is just like you use RGB and depth cameras. If you want to build a model of an object with signals at the distal end, we should be able to do that. So knowledge of these properties, such as shape and pose, would be pretty valuable for any downstream tasks that you have. So you could think contact rate manipulation, planning, control, all of these. And even with significant progress in state-of-the-art tactile sensing, going from your gel sites, gel slims, digit sensors, things like those, there is still quite an open question how you would use this sort of for a mapping problem. However, humans are pretty good at localizing and inferring objects just through touch. So for example, here's me trying to rummage and find a mug right on the top shelf. And I can do it pretty much without too much. Essentially, I can just blindly look for the mug and try to map out, trace its boundaries, and then find the edge of the mug. So for example, again, this dates back to a long time ago. So Klatsky and their seminal work blindfolded participants and tried to make them identify objects. And they concluded that global shape is actually a predominant means for identification of these. So trying to figure out these shapes is something that motivates us. But compared to vision, tactile mapping is quite a different beast. The first problem that you would have is that touch is intrusive. So any sort of implementation that you have must infer these object models while also accounting for any motion that is induced in these interactions. So this would be akin to having a camera that captures a scene, but each time you capture a frame of the scene actually is perturbed. Second aspect is something that Paloma covered, which is linking back to our analogy of the elephant and the blind observers, which is that unlike a camera, you do not actually get these global estimates of an object's shape or an object's pose, for example. So to first give you some sort of lay of the land on what is in SLAM and object manipulation, I would sort of divide the work as those that assume exact models of manipulants and try to do this pose estimation problem. So in Paloma's case, it's using these high dimensional signals to sort of localize and find out where these objects are in a scene. And the other is trying to having these fixed objects and you're trying to map and reconstruct them. So having some sort of structural constraints on these scenes and mapping them. So there's this small sliver in the middle, which is trying to both localize and map these objects. And as you can see, it's sort of an ill-posed problem. So there are a lot of these constrained settings in which these are operated, and ours is another such constrained setting, but we'll talk about it too. And so to get into first the localization work, a lot of the prior work sort of hinges on using these particle-based estimation methods. But it was soon evident that all these contact interactions cause a particle depletion problem. Estimation on a graph is something that is shown quite a good amount of success, both using tactile signals, so force torque sensors at the end of a robot, and using vision or some sort of passive perception. And that links to using these, again, dense sensors in conjunction with factor graphs to sort of figure out where you are in the scene, or to either localize using ICP and things like those. So we borrow some ideas from this graph-based estimation work, which tries to characterize the physics and the geometry of these interactions in a least square setting. So looking at the common classifications in the object mapping problem, we have point cloud methods, which are used to probabilistically fuse these 3D inputs, but these aren't very robust to noise, for example, cannot represent surfaces or uncertainties and require quite a comprehensive coverage of these objects. Implicit surface type methods have been successful in recovering object surfaces through either active or passive perception. And their surface potentials are typically described by an SDF. And these are usually informed by something like a Gaussian process, for example. More recently, there are learned methods for geometric learning, shape completion methods that try to leverage some semblance of knowledge of what we think these objects are in the world. We really value the expressivity and the generalization power of these implicit surface methods, and believe that any uncertainty that we get from these models could be used for future downstream tasks. The challenge, however, is integrating these evolving shape models into a graph-based estimation framework for as close as we can get to a full SLAM solution. So looking at all the work in the middle, for example, we can see Molen Erdmann, for example, considered the illustrative case of reconstructing the motion and shape of a smooth convex object between planar palms. Strub and others demonstrated like a full SLAM problem for a specific setting, which is a convex object rolled between two dexterous fingers. And you and others, which is probably the work closest to ours, recover the shape and pose of a planar object for tactile exploration. And this is formulated as an after-the-fact sort of batch optimization, where the shape is essentially represented as a piecewise linear polygonal shape. And we'll be using this as one sort of baseline in our comparisons, and we'll be borrowing a lot of ideas from this. So to concretely define the problem we're looking again at planar pushing on a frictional surface where we have a pusher moving around an object. We have a stream of tactile measurements that we're getting from a force torque sensor. We get the normal reaction measurements and the end effector positions for all of these. And the question is, can we estimate both the object shape and the pose from tactile events in real time? So this is a constrained version of the problem on a planar surface. To simplify a lot of these, we make a few assumptions here. So the first one is quasi-static interactions with the object to sort of give us a motion model, which is what informs our factor graph. We have a limit surface model that basically tells you the equations that govern between contact interactions with the frictional forces and the moments. We assume that we know the initial pose of an object to start out with. And we consider all of the interactions to be planar. So how we go about this problem is this sort of alternating optimization, where we go between mapping and localization steps. So we have a surface estimation step, which is sort of a regression problem using Gaussian processes. And we have a factor graph optimization that tries to use this information. So to first get into what the first part of that is, unlike point clouds, polygons, voxel maps, an implicit surface is sort of a non-parametric representation of an object. So when we represent it with a Gaussian process, for example, it could be faithful to arbitrary geometries, multiple objects, and amenable to probabilistic updates. So as seen from this figure right here, the surface is really this zero level crossing of the object's estimated sign distance function. So given an object's current pose and an accumulation of these sense, contact, and normal reactions, we have an approximate sign distance function that we can get. While the contact points condition the GP on zero SDF observations, the normals provide some sort of function gradient observations to tell us what is inside the object, what is outside the object. For example, we have the Stanford bunny here with some sort of synthetic contact measurements that we artificially add. The standard GP posterior equations give us the distance field, and we can generate an isocontour similar to what we have over here through something like a Martin cubes algorithm. Here we see one of these objects known as the butter shape in the MIT push data set. We have these artificial contacts that we add over time, and we get this isosurface, and we also get the function in 3D space here. One such problem is that these online GPs scale really poorly due to the cost of matrix inversion. And to alleviate this, we follow this sort of spatial clustering or partitioning of the entire space we're querying. And this is an idea taken from mobile robotics, taken from sonar-based SLAM, things like those, to sort of get us efficient GP querying and GP inference. So here, for example, if we have this very unstructured object, we have different spheres of influence so essentially we have multiple GPs representing the same object, and we know which ones to query to get surface estimates from each point. So if we have that sort of implemented, we can see that our implementation has lower query time. For example, here is the orange arrow on the bottom. So this is all towards getting some sort of real-time estimate of all of these. The second part is the localization module. So I won't go into this again because Paloma and probably many other speakers in the Tartan SLAM series talked about factor graphs. But the an essential idea is that there is previous work by you and others that sort of validate using a Gaussian assumption as valid for contact interactions, especially for a planar pushing type scenario. And if we're able to make this assumption, this essentially devolves to this nonlinear least squares problem that we can solve. So the sort of graph that we have representing these interactions try to ensure quasi-static interactions as a motion model, tries to ensure that there is some geometric validity to all of these by enforcing that the contact point is always on the object, try to enforce that if there are two pushers, there is no penetration with the object that we have. And the missing component here is from our shape perception, which is all of these are conditioned on the best estimate of the shape that we get periodically from the shape perception module, which gives us the surface of the object. So towards getting these real-time solutions, we try to incorporate our solution using ISAM2, which is incremental spooling and mapping, which incrementally updates the previous matrix factorizations with new measurements at each time step. So for real-time operation, we use the sort of fixed lag smoother, which is popular among aerial robotics, SLAM, things like those, where they want to get real-time windows of estimates while efficiently marginalizing out past time steps. So as you can see here, we have these bounded optimization times, while compared to those, if you just use ISAM normally, these would increase linearly with time. So now we have this back and forth optimization that lets us estimate the shape and pose of a planar object. So let's see how this works in practice. So first we'll evaluate in simulation using PyBullet, where we have these 3 object models from the MIT push dataset, and we try to push it around, get some data from this dual prong sort of setup that we have. These are some examples of the contour following trials that we have. We use a 2-fingered setup, corrupt these measurements with Gaussian noise, and try to collect them over a series of 50 trials to get some sort of statistical significance in our results. So starting from a circular prior and known initial pose, we can build the shape of these objects while also accounting for the pose of the objects as they keep moving. The GPIS representation we have here is smooth and generalizes well to these arbitrary objects. So it's not restricted to just polygons, for example. So we compare this with like a Hausdorff distance metric, which is telling you to an ordered subset of points or surfaces, and it tries to find the error between them. So we compare this against an incremental version of the piecewise polygonal representation that I talked to you about in the related work. And we see that while our performance here is quite similar for things such as rectangles, for example, in terms of error, we are significantly better in terms of smooth arbitrary surfaces such as ellipses. And also just the windows of our uncertainties are much better. Our standard deviations are much better. And in the root mean square error of the pose, which is trying to evaluate how good the localization is, it tells a similar story where we have similar performance for squares and things like those, but we have a larger degree of error for the baseline when we have more complicated objects. So for a real world setting, we use a single pusher to circumnavigate a square object, and we do this on this plywood surface that we have over here. So we see that with just touch, we can recover the shape and pose. It's less accurate than those of the simulation, but this is due to the lack of a second pusher and due to a lot of motion model uncertainty. If we have this assumption that we have some sort of proxy for visual tracking, so we periodically relocalize using global pose estimates, we can try to recenter these objects and things like those, which sort of motivates the more difficult like multimodal task. And we can see that there are better shape estimates in that case. And the graphs that we have here just reinforce these ideas, and there's some error metrics which you can refer to the paper for. So we'll conclude on some thoughts on future directions and what we've been working towards. So the first thing is, while this concerns purely just touch, a multimodal inference is more practical to solve for real world problems. So we wish to incorporate vision, map objects in the presence of heavy occlusions and things like those. An interesting idea is to extend this to 3D objects through interaction, where we want to use state-of-the-art tactile sensing, such as the gel site, for example, to sort of map these objects in the 3D problem where the GP kind of grows exponentially in terms of the computation. And finally, a larger set of objects that might have other latent properties that we want to reason about: elasticity, non-rigidity, transparent objects. This is sort of trying to relax the static world sort of assumption of SLAM, where we have these objects with geometries that can be molded in them and malleable. So trying to incorporate that sphere of objects is quite hard, and it's really an open question in terms of mapping these objects. So thank you. I hope I didn't go too much over time. Thanks for the organizers of this seminar for this great platform for us to talk about, and I'll stick around for questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Very fun. Okay, so we go now to the Q&A part of the seminar. If anybody on the Zoom wants to just unmute themselves and have a question, feel free to do so. Otherwise, I'll start with one question from our Q&A links. So I'll just read it. Given tactile-based localization and mapping in the context of humans is seldom used, how useful do you think it would be to have an active tactile sensing-based SLAM system in real-world robots? Would the main benefits be confined to indoor robots for embodied navigation or interaction, or do you think outdoor robotics can also benefit from this? And also, like, you, Paloma or Sudharshan, both, and when feel free, I guess, for this question to answer.
So you could
Paloma,
take this
you
one.
want to?
Okay.
Okay, I could take this too, or I could start and then you can fill in if you want. I think one area of interest that I could see is if you want to generate sort of these offline high fidelity reconstructions of objects, using something like vision or RGBD is fine, but these passive sensors tend to have a lot more noise, and using more precise estimates from something like a dense tactile sensor to sort of give us a good idea of what the object is and make an offline model per se of an object is one avenue that I see for using these tactile sensing methodologies. And that's where I think active reconstruction could especially be important. So reasoning about where you touch last and where you want to go next. Reasoning about occlusions. Are you looking at, if you're looking at a mug, which side of the mug are you looking at and where do you go next? Essentially, if you want a robot to just say, press a button, want a robot to just give you a model of an object, I think there's a need for this sort of full stack approach to it.
And maybe I could just add on the general tactile sensing side of things for like indoor applications. So I guess when I started looking at it, I would think like the vision sensors are sufficient, but like actually when you do look at when a robot's doing certain tasks, like manipulating small objects, reaching out into a drawer where it won't have vision sensing for it directly, like having the touch sensor be complementary to it and being able to localize with respect to your finger or something is actually really, really beneficial. And in fact, like I do want to point to like these class of sensors, which are kind of making like this problem of touch as a vision problem. And like it's like, I mean, GelSight and Digit, which is from Facebook, and GelSight from MIT, Rengen, they're all exciting sensors. There's also finger vision from Chris Atkinson's group. So they're all like, it's turning this problem of touch into a computer vision problem and making it like, and leveraging the tools developed for these image-based representations, like learning image features and stuff to really make this problem tractable. And I think that's an exciting direction where these sensors enter the realm of more conventional sensors that we are typically used to in the SLAM domain.
I have a question for Sudharshan. And so I noticed in your experiments that most of the objects you used were planar objects that were convex. And so how do you think your approach would work on non-convex objects?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I think we've also been asked that before, but there's nothing theoretically that precludes us from using these for any sort of arbitrary object geometries. We just found it easy starting with these to essentially all of our controls, and essentially the way we were interacting with these objects is kind of open loop. So to simplify all of those, we sort of just worked with these convex objects, because if you're going to circumnavigate a convex object, it's quite easy. You just use the normal reactions that you detect and move at an angle to that, and you should be fine. But yeah, when you start closing the loop, I think it's easier to interact with other geometries. But I don't think there's anything intrinsically in the theory that prevents us from working with those.
I see. Thank you.
Spinning off of that question, I was curious if this was something you had ever thought about testing with an unknown amount of objects. So like you might have one kind of flat rectangle, or you might have two. I come from more the field of mobile robotics rather than arms, and it's interesting to think about how that could extend to using this for more mobile SLAM or navigation.
Yeah, that's a good one too. It's a hard one actually, but I think a lot of, so if you glance to the field of object or object-centric manipulation, most methods sort of assume that there's like a single object on a tabletop and you just work with that. So the idea is, I think you first need some sort of segmentation method to sort of tell you, or to sort of declutter a scene and tell you like which object is which. So then there's this intrinsic data association problem as well. So I personally have not looked at this, but there are a lot of research groups that are looking at this sort of idea of having multiple objects and trying to work with those. But there is an inherent difficulty in working with multiple objects if you're trying to build models for all of them using this sort of a singular sort of implicit surface type method, for example. But yeah, that's a good hard question, I guess.
Ooh, thanks.
Go ahead.
Okay. So I would like to understand how, when we reach into our pockets, we pull out an appropriate object. And in the second talk, you basically said, well, we're going to want to touch it at a bunch of places, and somehow we'll factorize it so we ignore everything else in your pocket and the dynamics of the pocket. I'm a little dubious that it'll be at anywhere close to as easy as the 2D case. So I'm interested in your thoughts on how to do that. In the old days, I would have said, well, you reach in, you pull out a coin, but probably none of you know what coins are. So I don't know. You pull out something.
Yeah, so I think the primary motivation for sort of starting out with a planar pushing sort of scenario is that you have something akin to odometry or a motion model where you have quasi-static interactions, you know how they work on a plane approximately, and you can work with that. When you take it to sort of this unstructured 3D scenario, it's a bit harder. I mean, it's extremely hard, but I would argue that maybe if we're going to model it, you would start out maybe doing something like looking at force equilibrium constraints or something like that, where you start off with getting sensing at the end effector, trying to find forces, trying to reason about them. But then the models can only take you so far. So I think there should be some sort of learning in the loop for finding out all of this.
So my concerns would be the object moves by itself. So you can't assume you know where the object is. And my intuition, which could easily be wrong, is that you rely on multiple simultaneous contacts. And for humans, obviously, we have sensing all along our fingers. So when we touch something, it's often a very extended area, and it's on opposing surfaces. And it may be that instead of doing GP on the whole thing, you're using these little snapshots of opposing graphs in a much more limited way.
Okay, yeah, I get what you're saying. So if you have like a dexterous manipulator, you're trying to essentially for a given configuration of contacts, you can try to. So if we assume that we know what the object model is, I think it's doable. But if we're starting out from scratch, say we have some sort of rough prior on the object and we work with that, I think it's a very hard problem. So if we're limiting it to sort of a dig your pocket kind of scenario, you can't even use vision. So
in some ways, it's like trying to integrate radar observations of a moving target, which is changing relative orientation, and its radar cross section is changing all the time. And you sort of have to integrate this sort of very overall measurement of radar cross section and say, what object could have possibly generated this collection of views without sort of specifying, and I'm going to simultaneously estimate the object orientation.
yeah, so if you collect sort of a window of these observations, you can try to reason about it. But getting estimates on the fly is like really hard in that case. Then.
Well, I guess what I don't know what I'm questioning, but maybe I'm questioning the assumption that you want to do SLAM in the sense of localization or mapping.
So, Chris, maybe to answer, like address it a little bit, like in the sense of there's some recent techniques that we were trying on like different image representations other than like just using the direct RGB images that we'd get from these vision-based tactile sensors. So like translating it into, in this case, particularly like surface normal information. And that actually is quite informative over just like a touch sensor. So to the extent where you can say something about the local contact patch geometry, and like assuming that you can like track your finger as you're moving over that local contact patch geometry, you can, even without relying on an object model, sort of localize yourself with respect to that local patch geometry. And that can at least help with like inner pocket scenario where you have certain objects that you don't know much about, but like just by touching it at different places, you're constructing some patch models for such objects. Does that address to what you're thinking?
Maybe I'm old-fashioned, but maybe a point of view of what I'll call significant views. What tells you something is a coin is there is a grasp where it's very thin, and the instant you get that grasp, you pull it out. An object might have a sharp point or no sharp point, or be smooth like a ball, or be dimpled like a golf ball. And sort of the instant you get that significant feature, you're there.
Yeah.
And yeah, maybe I'm questioning the role of overall 3D pose and mapping, or in this case, modeling, in these tasks.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, I guess like it's not like a full 3D model. In even in that case that we would care about would be, we do care about the local features, right? Like to localize against. So there's one work which was like comparing against a global like set of a global dictionary, like from Alberta's group, in terms of localizing unique features from like a first touch or a single touch. So that one requires a global model, for example, or like an offline database. But you could also like do this task with local patch models. But I would think that you need some like notion of some notion of a local model to localize against, right? Like without that, just the binary information or just a single image information might not be sufficient to localize with respect to the object, or localize objects, which is generally the goal for this.
Yeah, so
Well,
probably a practical like flowchart of how this would work is if you have some sort of significant feature that you detect on an object, you have some sort of database or learned idea of what shape priors each object has, and you would sort of bootstrap anything with that idea of what a coin is or what a mug is, and then you work from there. But if you don't have a good prior idea of what these objects are, it's a really, really hard problem and probably not worth the effort.
all righty.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Questions?
Okay. Anybody has any more questions? Otherwise, I think this will be the end. So thank you very much, both of you, to be here today. It's a really great talk.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.